The Home World: Friendly Counsels for Homekeeping Hearts by Frances X. Doyle, S.J. Chapter 2: Old Familiar Things. In the home world, everything is familiar, so much so that you do not notice those details of life and living that surround you. The paper on the wall, for example, has become so much a part of your eyesight that you cannot tell offhand what color it is. Thus, the things we are most familiar with are the things we know least. This statement may sound strange, but truly here the old saying is verified that familiarity breeds contempt. You have but to test this argument on your friends. When you are at work today, ask your friend, "What is the color of the paper on the dining room wall?" You will get an answer like this: "The paper on the dining room wall? Why, it's a kind of blue, I think. One of those flower effects, you know. Oh, wait, maybe it's red. Now I come to think of it, it is red. But I may be mistaken. Really, I forget." The same may be said of the curtains on the windows. Unless you took a certain overweening pride in hanging them yourself, or in making them, it is safe to say that you will not notice them particularly until they have been taken down. Then their absence calls your attention to the fact that they were once there. It is like an alarm clock in your bedroom. If it stops, you know something is wrong. But while it ticked away the moments of your life, you never noticed it. You were familiar with the sound and forgot it. "Blessed is that home," says a modern writer, "in which for a whole lifetime associations have been gathering, until every figure in the carpet, and every panel of the door, and every casement of the window, and every chirography of its own, spelling out something about father or mother or son or daughter or friend that was with us a while. What a sacred place it becomes when one can say, 'In that room such a one was born. In that bed such a one died. In that chair I sat on the night I heard such a one had received a great public honor. By that stool my child knelt for her last evening prayer. Here I stood to greet my son as he came back from a sea voyage. That was my father's cane. That was my mother's rocking chair.'" What a joyful and pathetic congress of reminiscences! There is a good story told by a young Jesuit priest who served in the French army during the war. His name is Lieutenant Marcel Jauss, and as he had been trained in the military school before he became a priest, he was called to the colors as an artilleryman. He hated the work, for he was a priest, but he did his duty well. He wears the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. In describing the effect the noise of the big shells had on him, he said, "No one can realize it unless from actual experience. The explosion at first in the early days of the war seemed to shake the earth and break the ears. It was a tremendous uproar of sound, a hellish upheaval of noise. Gradually, when one heard this sound day after day, one got used to it. After 3.5 years, I was so habituated that when I was sent to Washington on the French military mission, I could not sleep at night. I grew very nervous. I did not know what was the matter. I sought the cause of the trouble, and finally came to the conclusion that I could not sleep because there was not noise enough. I missed my big shells." Certainly this was a strange sound to lull a man to sleep, and yet when the noise was absent, Father Jauss missed it. He was not suffering from the ordinary shell shock, but from the loss of his shell music. He had become used to the hissing lullaby of death. The American soldiers, in the same way, found difficulty in sleeping in a mere four-walled room when they returned from overseas or from camp. They had been used to the large room of outdoors, with a sky for roof, and the wind blowing fresh on their faces. When they came home and got into bed and tried to sleep, they choked. There was not enough air. Such is man, a creature of custom, a piece of putty that can be molded quite rapidly into various forms which he hates to lose once they are fixed on him. So it is the same way with the curtains on the windows of your home. You could not describe them, especially if you are a man, and more, you could not realize how much they add to the warm home comfort. But when they are taken down and the cold glass of the window stares harshly at you, you know at once that something has gone wrong. A familiar thing is absent. Even the china cups and saucers, the plates and knives and forks, are things of importance in the home world. They make up those details that are called local coloring, and yet they exist as such only in your inner consciousness. Put a new cup on the saucer for breakfast, and you notice it at once. How many times have you passed over the old one unnoticed? "Why, look," you will say, "here's a new cup. It's got a green border." The chairs and tables are old familiar things. The tablecloths you have admired in your youth, wondered at in your middle age, and laughed at when you came back from your own very modern home to see the old folks. Now consider the clock on the dining room mantelpiece. There's a brave Indian rider on a prancing horse. The savage holds a long, sharp spear, and the horse has one foreleg gracefully curved. The set of his head is magnificent. The flowing mane is majestic. You can smell the fresh breeze that is blowing. Now, when you were young, you used to stand in front of the mantelpiece and marvel at that clock. First, it spoke to you for a long time in little rusty-like whisperings. Ticky-ticky-tock, ticky-ticky-tock. And the red Indian looked ferociously at you, and the horse seemed very wild. The Indian's menacing spear sent a thrill through your young blood, and you could never get over the marvel of so much splendid action frozen in one small piece of bronze. But the best of all times in your youth was the striking of that clock. When you remember it now, close your eyes, and if it is striking 9 o'clock in the evening, you can see your white-haired grandmother knitting at the dining-room table, and the old grandfather quietly sleeping in the wide-armed rocker. Notice how his head has fallen to one side? Perhaps your brother John, who is going off to college, is frowning over the Greek or Latin, or maybe a problem in geometry. You can see the lamp with a soft red shade. Your younger sister is studying very hard, and you rejoice your eyes at the calm beauty of her face. You? What are you doing? Can you remember as you watch the old clock now? Well, you were in the corner talking with your mother, and Dad was near the lamp, poring over the political sheet and shaking his head at the downfall of the world. Suddenly the clock groans, chimes a warning, and then strikes 9 silver strokes of home music. Your grandfather wakes up with a stiff neck and rubs it hard to restore the circulation. John's brow clears. He had set a time limit to his work, and the problem was solved. He works by the clock and is just as systematic now. Your pretty sister looks up, gasps at the time, and turns back to her work. Your grandmother looks around the room, smiles one of those wrinkly old smiles that are filled with such deep knowledge of human life. Then perhaps you kissed your mother and went to bed, yawning hard as you tramped wearily up the stairs. Anyhow, stand in front of the clock now, shut your eyes, and submit yourself willingly to its magic spell, and you will easily see all those dear things of the past that can come back to you now only in vision. True, the clock and the prancing horse and the Indian remain. The clock speaks as sweetly as ever of the flowing tide we call time. But, well, the old grandparents are not there any more, and in many, many homes the mother's voice is no longer heard, and the boys and girls are away far and wide, working in other little worlds of their own. If growth to manhood and womanhood has brought you many favors and blessings, it has also taken many away, and these you recall once in a while when you come back into the world of the old home and see all its familiar surroundings and settings. Think of the influence the old home had on you, and then ask yourself very honestly about your influence on the world of your own home nowadays. Our hearts, says Oliver Wendell Holmes, are held down to our homes by innumerable fibers, trivial as I have just recalled. But Gulliver was fixed to the soil, you remember, by pinning his head a hair at a time. Even a stone with a whitish band crossing it, belonging to the pavement of the backyard, insisted on becoming one of the talismans of memory. But the plants that come up year after year in the same place give me the liveliest home feeling. Close to our ancient gambrel-roofed house is the dwelling of pleasant old neighbor Walrus. I remember the sweet honeysuckle that I saw in flower against the wall of his house a few months ago, as long as I remember the sky and the stars. That clump of peonies, budding their purple heads through the soil every spring in just the same circle, and by unpacking their hard balls of buds and flowers big enough to make a double handful of leaves, has just come up in the same place, neighbor Walrus tells me, for more years than I have passed on this planet. It is a rare privilege in our nomadic state to find the home of one's childhood and its immediate neighborhood thus unchanged. Many born poets, I am afraid, flower poorly in song, or not at all, because they have been too often transplanted. The old-fashioned mantelpieces, with their quaint statuettes and embroidered hangings, form a bright bit of color in your home world. Perhaps they do yet, but in apartment house life, these ancient ornaments are out of date. They take up too much room, and the loss is really never made up. The kitchen stove has disappeared with the years, and a modern gas contrivance has taken its place. Can you remember the wonderful smell of baking bread soaring through the house like a blessing? Can you remember the huge slice of fresh bread your mother gave you when you returned home after school? You had to bring up the coal for the fire, that's true, and it was never an agreeable performance. Still, on a winter's night, with the wind trying to wreck the house and shrieking and yelling outside like a demon, that warm coal fire and that clean kitchen and the loaves of fresh bread on the table were things to be proud of, and in your heart there was great contentment. That is, if you were a homebody and loved simplicity. Nowadays it seems as if all those fine old things were to be laughed at. The mistake is a sad one, and the sooner we all return to the strength of that ancient home with its wonderful simplicity and peace, the sooner shall we sophisticated, proud, and foolish moderns become almost as good as the great people who bore us, who trained us and finally left us to rush headlong into the icebergs we are now. So the poet sings of the changes time has brought. This is my home again, once more I hail the dear old gables and the creaking vanes. It stands all flecked with shadows in the moon, patient and white and woeful. 'Tis so still. It seems to brood upon its youthful years, when children sported on its ringing floors, and music trembled through its happy rooms. An old man was moaning about modern improvements. His pet trouble was the loss of mantelpieces. With him there was a particular affection for a certain mantelpiece, and in trying to find out his grudge against us moderns, we finally wormed the story out of him. Why, he said, it was this way. My father was a big man, 6 feet and more. My mother was small, 5 feet 2 inches. We boys used to pick her up and carry her around the house many times, despite her protesting cries. When we were young boys just growing up, we never hoped to be as big as Pop. But when we began to reach up to the mantelpiece in the dining room, Mother would sigh and say, "Jim is as big as I am." Regularly, every birthday, Pop lined up the boys and girls and made Mom stand at the mantelpiece. Her dear head just reached the top. Then there was excitement and accurate measuring to see if the boy was as big as his mother. Soon she was the smallest of her family, and then there was a celebration. I can always see the mantelpiece and one of those frilly hangings with a lot of raised work on the borders. I forget what they call them. Lambrequins, isn't it? And I can always see my mother standing there with Pop measuring the children by her head. My mother! She has been dead for 50 years. May God grant me the grace to see her soon. I shall be as proud of her in heaven as I was on earth. The old man, after all is said, had a good reason to like mantelpieces. He evidently loved that particular one for its associations with his mother. Her influence over the children in her homeworld must have been very powerful, as it was gentle and lasting. The story is related of Henry Clay, the eloquent old man of the Senate, that when he lay dying, his fevered brain brought up images of his mother long since dead, and the old man cried out continually, "My mother, mother, mother!" This is a short index of the influence Clay's mother had upon him in early life, and we can wish nothing more blessed in a home than this motherly influence which survives age and the passing of years and the glitter of glory. The home on earth is called the vestibule of heaven, where all the precious mothers of the race are waiting to continue that love and influence which they began on earth, and left off for a little time to go see God. Consider this picture sketched by a son thinking of his mother. There she sits, the old Christian mother, ripe for heaven. Her eyesight is almost gone, but the splendors of the celestial city kindle up her vision. The gray light of heaven's morn has struck through the golden locks, which are folded back over the wrinkled temples. She stoops very much now under the burden of care she used to carry for her children. She sits at home too old to find her way to the house of God, but while she sits there, all the past comes back. And the children that 40 years ago tripped round her armchair with their griefs and joys and sorrows, those children are gone now, some caught up into a better realm where they shall never die, and others out in the broad world testing the excellency of a Christian mother's discipline. Her last days are full of peace, and calmer and sweeter will her spirit become, until the gates of life shall lift and let the worn-out pilgrim into eternal springtide and youth, where the limbs never ache and the eyes never grow dim, and the staff of the exhausted and decrepit pilgrim shall become the palm of the immortal athlete. When we are dead 50 years, we may not have anyone to remember us as nicely and as heartily as the old gentleman remembered his mother. But this is an iron fact, unbreakable and lasting, that if we do exert a holy, strong influence in the home world, and in every other world we enter and leave during the day, someone will remember us, if not by name, certainly by our good deeds. St. Augustine thus describes the death of his mother, St. Monica, who had borne him not only into the world by her sufferings, but also brought him forth into the Catholic Church by her unceasing tears. In his Confessions he says, "In the 9th day, therefore, of her illness, in the 56th year of her age, that devout and holy soul was released from her body. I closed her eyes. Grief took possession of my very soul, and poured itself out in tears, so that my eyes, with the violence of sorrow, wept themselves dry, and I suffered greatly from this anguish of sadness. Nor did we deem it fitting to celebrate that death with murmuring tears and groans, this being the ordinary way of showing grief for a certain destitution, or a sort of total extinction, which men attribute to the dead. But she neither died unhappily, nor was hers any death at all. This was firmly impressed on our minds both by the unerring example of her conduct and by her genuine faith. Thus did a saint weep for his mother, also a saint, and acknowledge her influence on his soul. Augustine speaks most tenderly of his mother's loss, as may be seen from the suffering he experienced after the burial. When the body was removed, we returned tearless to our home. For I did not weep, even during the prayers we prayed to thee, as the sacrifice of our redemption was offered for her when the corpse was placed by the grave before it was lowered, according to the usual rite. But all day long I suffered great anguish of heart, and in my agitation I asked thee, as best as I could, to calm my grief. Yet thou wouldst not. Then I slept on, and, awakening, found my grief not a little softened. And being as I was in the solitude of my bed, those true verses of thy servant Ambrose occurred to my mind. For thou art Maker of all, the Lord, and Ruler of the height, who robing day in light hast poured soft slumbers o'er the night, that to our limbs the power of toil may be renewed, and hearts be raised that sink and cower, and sorrows be subdued. The prayer he offers our Lord in her behalf is affecting in its fervor and simple faith. He begs mercy for the sins of his mother. Forgive her, O Lord, forgive her, I beseech thee, and enter not into judgment with her. He urges our Lord to remember that Monica desired nothing more than to be commemorated at the altar, which she had served without a single day's intermission. From the altar she knew that the holy victim is dispensed, by whom the handwriting that was against us is blotted out. Thy handmaid enchained her soul to his sacrament of our redemption by the bond of faith. Let no one withdraw her from thy protecting arm. May she rest then in peace.